Nos vamos sentando.
Please take your seats.
Ya empezamos. Buenas tardes. Vamos a dar comienzo con la primera mesa social.
Okay, so we're gonna get started with more rock and roll. We're gonna start with the second social roundtable.
Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Ada Santana Aguilera.
Hello, I'm Ada Santana Aguilera. I'm the president of the Young Women Federation. I'm in charge of moderating this roundtable. Thanks to the Institute for Women for trusting us, and the Young Women Foundation is the entity that I represent to moderate this roundtable. Yeah, Federation, we're younger than 30 years old. I know that we are not a lot of people here. We're quite a few. I know that we are all young in soul.
Pero bueno, hoy mi papel es pues reivindicar esa agenda.
My role is to make a reivindication of that young woman, because we hear this word a lot, but this generational change does not arrive, and I would like to participate now. Not when I'm 40 or 50 years old. It is when I have to participate. I would like to participate right now. It would be good. I don't know where I will be in 20 years time, so it would be good to take advantage of this time. And we were speaking about this agreement between young and older women to set the agenda that could represent all the group of women. I'm 21 years old, and there are 14-year-old women that won't relate on me, because of course I didn't relate on people at the university when I was 14. For example, I do not relate with a 30-year-old woman with children. That's logic, I think. I'd like to make a brief reflection, because we speak a lot about youngness and youth, and I think that we're all aware of the fact that we're not in the 80s or the 90s anymore. Young people are not the same. But in exchange for that, the participation models are the same. We make young people from 2019 to participate as they used to do. When I find a young girl and I ask her, how can you participate? It's like, well, you find two girls more, you create some bylaws, you create an association, everything. It's really cumbersome. That it's like Chinese language, right? It's very interesting, but it's like, okay, I think I'm scaring you. But we need to think that we have progressed a lot, and participation has to progress. So I know that social media, for example, have their advantages and disadvantages, but we need to know how to take advantage of it. For in my case, Greta, a 15-year-old Swedish girl, has been able to spread her word all around the world. And 2 days ago, we all went out to the streets to claim for that climate emergency. Our colleague Laura will speak about this topic, because I'm not the expert on this. She will give us much more. She will get into that in much more detail. And in 2019, the way we participate is not the same as during the 80s, and the needs are not the same either. My needs are not the same as a 50-year-old woman, for example. And a 60-year-old woman will not feel represented by me, for example. So this happens with me too. And one of the topics that is a clear example to me, and I'll take advantage to make an ad. Today it is a reproductive rights day, and we have been speaking about abortion. To me, this is the perfect topic to show that rights are circular. What has been accomplished is not accomplished yet, and we need to fight against, and we need to fight to make it. It's true that Gallardón, he was a former Ministry of Justice here, Minister of Justice here in Spain, did not make what he wanted, but in 2015 there was a reform that affected young people, young girls of 16 and 17 years old that wanted to abort, and they need their parental authorization. But we say that you can have sexual relationships when you're 16, but you can't abort if you are under 18. So I encourage you to go to San Bernardo. It is where the demonstration will start in order to claim this key right for women. We can't forget that many political parties still put that into question, and in the demonstration, I think that it is called by the feminist movement in Madrid, if I'm not mistaken. So without further ado, I'll introduce this amazing round table that I have with me. Well, great speakers. I think that we will have a great time all together. And we move to the part of civil society. They are the ones who will make this analysis. They will make their proposals. They will say what's working, what's not. And for that, I'll start with Judith Carreras. She works for the ILO, Spanish office. So I give the floor to her. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to say thanks to the Institute for Women for the invitation, and before I speak, I would like to clarify something so that there are no misunderstandings. I represent the ILO. The ILO is an UN agency specialized in topics that have to do with work, with labor aspects, etc. The information that I'm going to convey is to present some of the last reports issued by the ILO related to labor market. It is an organization that is its anniversary this year. It's its birthday. It was created 100 years ago. We have a great future ahead of us, and it was born with a three-folded approach. It's not only for governments but also for civil societies and trade unions. So this is the point. When we think about new ways of participation, we need to think that in 1919 there was a UN agency with a three-folded character, where civil society was not only consulted but also they helped in that decision-making process. There's an element that is absolutely in force, and this is the idea that without social justice there can't be universal peace, and there can't be social justice without decent work and without gender equality. So about this is what I wanted to speak about in a very brief way about some reports, and we have an issue that could be interesting for the discussion that is taking place here. So first of all, I think that we shouldn't elaborate on it because you all know it very well. Three characteristics that define the situation of women in the labor market is a lower participation. We see it all over the world. A situation of a part-time jobs. In many cases, it's not voluntary, and what we call feminized works. It is where there are mainly women that are less. They're less considered, and they're worse paid. So now we are balancing all these 25 years in order to set some elements that we are concerned about. First of all, we have to say that gender gaps compared to these main labor market indicators have not reduced significantly during the last 20 years. We live in a moment where there was some progress, but this progress is not significant. as regards the labor market. During the crisis, we've seen that some of these areas have seen some backlashes in terms both of regional and global scale, so we need to speed up. And the other conclusion that we could draw from that is that the gender equality policies have to focus on that pace generation. In a moment and in a context where we are seeing that societies and labor markets are changing in a dramatic way, in what we could call a constant fragmentation of labor market, we need to analyze, and I will make a short reference, how what we call the technology revolution, responses to climate change will be related to some challenges that were on the table. So having said this, I would like to mention a couple of main topics that have been mentioned by some reports issued by the ILO. First of all, the wage gap or the salary gap. It's just the tip of the iceberg. We could speak about the social insurance gap. We know that this gap has an influence on pensions, on the wages, and we know that, well, beyond numbers, I think that we could point out some of the elements that we are seeing through the data that we analyze, because beyond discussion of, well, wage gap of 14% an hour, for example, in Spain, this is a 23% a year, because obviously women have more time, more part-time, so that increases as year goes by. In Spain, for example, we would say that it is on the European average. The important thing is to see and understand why this wage gap happens, because sometimes there are speeches on the table that not necessarily explain what the wage gap is. So in order to intervene, we need to understand, why do I say this? Because in many cases, the reason of the wage gap is that women have, for example, worse educational level than men. That's not only not true, but also if we divide salaries in tenths, we would see that women in every single tenth have a higher education level as men that are in that same tenth. That is, women are doing works with lower qualification, with higher qualification, sorry, but with a lower salary. So we would have to put that on the table, but we don't only look at that. We even said, well, sometimes we're told, well, the salary gap has to do with the fact that women have a discontinuous career, so to speak. So what happens in this case? Because of the children sometimes, so they usually are not keen on doing extra hours, and they have less chances of being promoted. So these are objective reasons. No, I'm not speaking about the fact of being shared or correct, but they are objective reasons. One of the ILO's researches tried to give what we call explainable factor. These are elements that are not shared, but are objective. If we remove that explanation, in principle, there shouldn't be any wage gap. Sorry. But the point is that in every single country there is a wage gap, so the explanation can only be discrimination. And for that we could speak individually about some countries, for example Sweden, the country that is the role model because they have the lower wage gap. But if you apply this, women in Sweden should be earning 2 points more than men, so there would be a salary gap in favor of women. So the factor of objective reasons that they're not shared, they're not correct, but they could be objectivable, so to speak. Let us explain this discrimination element. But at the last, thanks to the last survey that we issued, we are told, okay, well, women are in sectors that are feminized, that are less considered, that are less productive. So it's true that this is why they earn less. This happens, and we have to intervene on that. But we conducted a study with 1 million companies in Europe of different sizes, and we said, well, let's pick up companies that belong to the same economic sector, that have similar production levels, in order to dismantle these elements that we were saying. So there, they should have the same salary because they have the same level of production. So the companies that in their majority had women in their staff earned 15% less than those companies that were mainly male, belonging to similar production sectors. So what happens? We're speaking about 3,500 gross less a year. So in general terms, contribution of women to the labor market is less considered than men. Why do we think that that's important? Because this is what I was telling you. It lets us understand the gap and act and take an action in front of some speeches on the table, and from here on we can launch different public policies. For example, motherhood. This is the second aspect. We say that motherhood penalizes. I don't like that, but it's true. Up to 30 years old, men and women have, well, more or less, well, there's no salary gap. We see that in every single country. After 30 years old, the European Union, there's a separation at wage gap. Why? Because at 30 years old, that is around the age where many of us become mothers. So this gap takes place, or doesn't take place equally in every single country. There are some countries, like for example the UK, where this gap is much bigger, but really much bigger. For example, 25% compared to mothers without children, compared to other countries like France or Spain. Why? Because it shows that public policies set the difference. So the countries that have public policies that are focused on co-responsibility elements and maternity leave, paternity leave, etc., have a lower gap than others that don't. But we still see it in every single country. Now we should analyze it. But the part that we have not analyzed is that as far as there's penalization for because of motherhood, there's a bonus because of becoming a father for paternity. Switzerland, for example, 17%. Men that have children earn 17% more than the ones that don't. In Korea, up to 26%. In Austria, 7%. So what happens? It happens that, normally speaking, the paternal figure, as we consider him as the family head of family, we consider that he's going to maintain his family with a better income, etc. But women, it's like, no, they're going to go away, they will set different priorities with their children and work, etc. So there are some associated discriminations that are also reflected on the labor information, and we thought that it was important to underline it. How can we fight against these discrimination, and how can we guarantee public policies that can tackle that? And this brings us to the next block in terms of conclusions that was important to underline. Caretaking. And other, well, here the ILO, a big part of the conceptual progress that has been experienced during last year's, has been fostered by all the reflections and the insights of the feminist movement, where we have put on the table the idea of, without solving this social caretaking, we won't be able to solve the gaps that take place in the labor market. In terms of caretaking, for example, well, I don't know, here in Spain there are 130 millions of daily hours devoted to caretaking. If we monetize that, we would be speaking about 16 million people working full-time in caretaking, 15% of GDP. So in non-paid caretaking, 68% are done by women. So this explains what we were saying before. There's more part-time, professionally speaking. We would say that, well, it's different, so there's a good and bad news. We've progressed a little bit during the last years. During the last 20 years, women in total, we've stopped from doing, on average, 15 minutes a day of non-paid work. Men have contributed 8 minutes more a day. So the difference is explained because there's an increase of public services, sometimes an outsourcing to the private sector of these chores. So we are seeing that there's some kind of improvement, but it would entail 200 years in order to balance the non-paid chores. In Spain, for example, things are better. We have to say that during all this time we've reduced by 5 minutes, and men have increased their contribution by 12. We will accomplish that in 68 years, not in 200. However, these are the figures that we can see around this topic. In terms of proposals, a key aspect that has already been mentioned is to put in value this caretaking tasks, and an important change that took place in the ILO. In 2013, there was something that was called the Chiefs of State Conference, where we defined the indicators aimed at measuring. So ILO has always been focusing on work, what happens in the labor market, but since 2003, the chiefs of state have said, well, we understand work or labor, both paid and unpaid job. This is a very important aspect. Now, even countries, when developing statistics, when analyzing things, need to take into account the weight of the non-paid labor. This, for example, means that sentence of inactive women, the ones that do not work. Well, inactive women are not women anymore. They are the ones that are not in the labor market. They are not inactive, because we'll have to see that 25% of them can't work because they are assuming some caretaking chores that don't let them work. So this is a shift in the concept that has been promoted and fostered by reflections that have been put on the table by the feminist movement, that forces the institutions to update in terms of approaches and analysis that they conduct. Some other elements, well, of course, in the recommendations that are made, you say, well, the future in labor needs to have time to take care of people. For example, paternity and maternity leaves, etc. These aspects are key. For example, in the government of Spain, this is a very important movement. The co-responsibility policies are clear. I mean, this idea of time to take care of people, both men and women. If we say that caretaking is important, we need to have time to take care of people. And public policies are important too. In Europe, for example, the population is aging. So somebody would say, well, what's the need of having schools for children between 0 and 3 years old? But we have an aging population, and this is how aren't we going to offer a decent elderly years to all the people? So how we do organize these caretaking chores? We need resources, we need potential of employment, labor creation. There's an important niche of labor creation. We'll have to speak about quality and the quality of unemployment. Here we would have to point out how important the Convention 189 of ILO is in terms of domestic workers. There are 29 ratifications up to now. Among them, we expect to see Spain join these ratifications. Other important aspects that we see, well, equal opportunities are important to the actions that are taken in terms of promotion, in terms of co-responsibility and caretaking policies. And another important aspect, I'm going to leave one name on the table. We were speaking about glass walls. Sometimes we see that women are getting in a very powerful way in technology sectors, but what happens when you have a look at the different departments where they are focused? The vast majority of them are in HR, but the things that are called core, for example, in aspects that have to do with strategy, technology, etc., women are not there. So they can't not only access to some sectors, but also it's like, well, this glass wall, sticky floor in companies. It's like violence and harassment at work. Well, these are two important aspects. Sometimes this prevents women from having full professional development. And in June this year, the ILO, in the framework of its anniversary, approved the first agreement on a global scale that has to do with violence and harassment at work in order to tackle this aspect. And we think that it is very important, both its passing and its implementation. We know that conventions generate a political discussion moment, and this morning the European Institute for the Gender Equality has put a lot of information on the table. Two more aspects: voice and representation. This is key, and we can see it at the trade unions part. And I will finish with this. Part of the discussions that we've had are linked to an inclusive work future. It's not only about future, but also about present. Everything that has to do with technology revolution. It's key to guarantee that these changes that are taking place, they should not get deeper into some of the aspects that we were mentioning, but we should be able to solve some gaps. And we have to say that we don't have 200 years. We have the 2030 agenda, and it tells us that for 2030 we should have solved it. So I would say it's not a log for my boy, my girl. No. It's not a professional agenda. It's not a professional log. We want to see that in my professional lives. So until 2030. We have time, so the great work that is being developed by many of the organizations that are here gives us a possibility of we won't need 200 years, and for 2030, at the latest, we'll have it. Thank you.
Pues pasamos ahora a la compañera Filomena Judith.
She's going to speak about, well, she's the representative of the State International Family Planning and Beijing platform. She has the floor. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm from the Planning Federation. That is one of the organizations that is part of the BEIJING+25 platform. And this platform has been working for some months, and we will work during the whole year about topics that are included in BEIJING+25 agenda. I'm going to give you some hints. I'm going to give you some figures that are linked to health, because we especially deal with a platform in terms of health. Health as an important engine to eradicate poverty, social protection in social services. So social protection, well, I will convey some important messages because we don't have much time, because today we will celebrate the demonstration in favor of the reproductive and sexual rights. It is health, education among some groups of people. We understand health, education, employment, and to live in a violence-free world. We've talked about labor and employment, and you've mentioned education. Every single woman that has been able to end up their degree are able to get into the labor world. The problem is that glass ceiling. If we have a look at what happens in Europe, there's an unbalanced development, and I think that that's really important. I will speak about Spain, but I wanted to convey some figures, especially in terms of access to health, in terms of sexual and reproductive health in Europe, especially in the East countries. Well, in Europe, the usage of contraception measures is the lowest on average is lower than emerging countries or underdeveloped countries. For example, 37% of people in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Tajikistan, etc. Well, we are speaking about countries that are in Eastern Europe, don't have access to modern contraception systems. And this creates, or this is an important factor because it creates consequences in a row, so to speak. It could provoke teenager pregnancy, and it takes people away from the rising process that they could have, or they could come over, in terms of limiting factors that our emancipation has. These are some hints from the European Union, following what you were mentioning about young people. We need to consider something very important. There are 90 million young people in Europe. So, to me, it is very important that they could all have access to sexual and reproductive health. In Europe, according to figures from 2017, 91% of citizens consider that it's very important to guarantee a fair, democratic, and equal society. Like there are, for example, European conventions, Human Declaration of the European Union. It says that an important part is to respect what Beijing platform agreements are, as well as the agreements that were reached during the International Conference of El Cairo. This means to boost protection and right fulfillment of every single person, and to have a great control. This is very important, and it has to be said by the European Union. On international scale, we're having this very many problems, to include this word, the control over sexuality and sexual health, to make decisions with responsibility and freedom. So freedom and responsibility are two words that are being used in English when we speak about young people, when we speak about sexual orientation. I mean, we speak about responsibility and not about right age.
This is important to mention because sometimes, or many times, we work on emphasizing the final agreements, and we emphasize, or we foster the governments to include in the language a new language that might be considered as an agreed language. And this about responsibility is a very important element. Now, speaking about health, it is important to consider that health and reproductive and sexual health were key topics in one of the meetings of the General Assembly of the UN. On the 23rd of September, that is last Monday, we had a meeting on New York on universal health coverage. It was a very important meeting, and we deem it normal, although we have many co-payment cases, and this is one of our struggles. But in many countries, there is no coverage. And in many countries of Western Europe, this happens as well. I mean, the user has to pay for a part in the co-payment, although the other part is partly covered by Social Security. But there is indeed a co-payment, defined one, and pre-established and re-established one. This is the reason why economic difficulties in this important meeting that was held last Monday, that was seen as one of the key points that limited the access to an integral health. And this is why, among the recommendations that we're giving in the end, one of the recommendations was trying to minimize and limit the health co-payment, trying to ensure information and the access to all health services, especially or particularly reproductive and sexual health for teenagers and girls, and also that the government should increase their investments onto this up to 5% of the GDP. And then also there should be an appropriate follow-up and monitoring mechanism of these policies. I want to share with all of you that all the community that worked on reproductive and sexual health, we had a period of 1 year up to the 23rd of September to include this sexual and reproductive health in this agreement. And this is linked to another important point that was mentioned this morning, where reproductive freedom and gender equality are under attack. That is, we have included health and reproductive and sexual health because after long negotiations, especially with some countries like United States, which is clearly a very important country, which didn't want to include that part together with other countries. In the European part, these countries are Hungary, Poland, and Malta. Why am I telling you this? Because many of us who are in feminist associations and that work together with women, we do feel that this is a key moment to work in an efficient and coordinated way in our resistance and also in our reaction, which is the whole coercive movement. But you will hear me, a compelling movement, you will hear me speaking about reproductive freedom. And maybe we need to underline the freedom or the liberties in this sense, because we should go beyond what we have been doing so far, and we need to consider this together as the topic of considering it as coercive or compelling. In Malta, for example, women cannot not keep a baby when they are pregnant if this pregnancy has not been planned. And this is very important to say. In Malta, this is happening, and is something, somebody is obliging me, is forcing me to do something that I don't want to do. And this is really important to say. Well, now we need to change the language. And in Russia, this is happening as well. I thank you very much. But this is a very important piece of work. We need to change it from the grassroots. In Russia, there is an important bullying against all movements and the LGBT community. And in Lithuania, we don't have a law that can enable or give this reproductive freedom to women. These movements and these parties, because many of these are political parties, and we know this, do not have very transparent budgets. And in many cases, they are based on, on a finding budget. And they are based, as I was saying, on a language that takes what we're doing as something compulsory, that is, forcing women to abort. I don't know if you remember the speech given by Gallardón when we were speaking about violence. That is, society does not enable women to have children. I don't know if you remember that. That was terrible. At that moment, we didn't realize that. But yes, it was the beginning of a new language. And this is the reason why we all think, that we need to safeguard the right of everybody to live safe and non-discriminatory reproductive life, eradicate violence, gender violence, and violence against women, and we will hear more about this, to claim with force all the regressive speech or discourse that undermine equal rights and gender equality and reproductive rights. And also we need to achieve the fact that the European Union considers this as a priority to achieve social regulations and social standards, together with reviewing I don't remember the word in Spanish. The possibility of carrying out public activities and having this requirement of public activity by some organizations that should not have it. I don't know if you saw yesterday's article on public utility organizations saying that gay people, homosexuals, could be healed and could be medicated. Well, that's a public utility. Other organizations that are present here have removed the public utility because they abhorred from them and they denounced us. And we should revisit all that again. And I would say, well, I would end up by saying, well, this is the last point of the coordination. Coordination among us is really important, to be firm, to be together, to be joined, and to ensure that our freedom is not going to be limited, at least what we have achieved so far. Well, thank you very much. We're going to give the floor to Montserrat Vila, the last speaker of this platform. She represents the Istambul Sombra and BEIJING+25 platforms. You have the floor, Montserrat. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would like to thank this good organization that you have carried out with these sessions. I'm in the Istambul Sombra, so something like Istambul Shade and BEIJING+25 platforms. I begin by saying that the 21st century is going to be the century of the eradication of macho violence or gender violence. 25 years ago, we saw this Beijing platform, and this is framed within the movement of all women of the world. And we try to locate this mobilization as a turning point that will change the structures of the current society, putting at the center the life of people and rendering it unthinkable to have to exert violence against women and looking at the world with the eyes of a woman. Violence against women, as these different conventions that we're analyzing these days recommend, this is structured. It comes from this domination of men over women in all scopes of life. This is the violence suffered by women just by the mere fact of having been born women, and the one that exert men just for having this social mandate of dominating women. This violence comes from patriarchy as an order that is based on this authority, leadership, and power of men over women. Gender violences in different manifestations, be it sexual violence, obstetric violence, harassment, violence against women in armed conflicts, and a very long, etc., have been and are normalized and justified within society with multiple stereotypes, gender stereotypes, myths, and always justifying them. Even from the times of Aristotle to nowadays, we women have been qualified as non-people, soulless entities, instigators of all evil, instigators of the rapes that what are inflicted on us. We have been always Adam's rib. According to Heather Lockhart, patriarchy has been adopted by all economical systems throughout the history, from a culture and a moral that is understood and practiced from generation to generation, and serves only to keep aggressions against women as if it were a biological and natural phenomenon that has been legitimized and therefore allowed in all social scopes. This is an oppression that prevents from effective equal rights and effective liberty or liberties. This movement that is becoming more effective in the latest years it's broken. Well, it's cracked, let's say. This patriarchy structure is now being cracked thanks to a movement. This is what I mean. And the demands and the changes of the social model, the changes of relationships between men and women that are demanded in these mobilizations go to the grassroots of the violence, the causes for violence. In all continents, in a global way or globally, women of all ages, but mainly young women of different cultures and identities in all belonging to all spheres of society. Well, it is demonstrated, it is proven that we can lead this change. We do not accept only little revisions of our rights. We want to have full rights, and not only formal rights, but all rights for a violence-free life. It is in this context that we're revising or reviewing the Beijing+25 concept. 27 years after the CEDAW recommendation, 25 years after the Beijing platform, several years after the Istambul Convention, and we were asking ourselves how these international instruments are being used to attend the women that are suffering from gender violence and to prevent it and eradicate it from the society. When signing these conventions, the states are responsible for all the acts or omissions of their stakeholders, agents, organs, bodies, etc., when they constitute violence against women. The civil servant and the executive powers and legislative powers must follow these recommendations, but they are lagging behind, and in some cases they are not even complying with this. Many times when we speak about the rights of women, we are not aware and we do not evidence the fact that the state and its institutions are or can be the authors of this violence themselves, be it by an action or by omission or by being responsible to those facts. We consider institutional violence the one received by women when they are not attended or heard in institutions with the appropriate resources, or when there is a secondary victimization, when doubting of their word, and in all these means still myths, stereotypes and prejudices are being used to continue exerting this violence by their aggressors. It is very important, of course, to pass laws, but too many times they are diluted and neutralized when implementing them and developing them. The lack of budget enough or money enough are always making all this situation worse, especially when with these institutions, the patriarchal institutions. We've seen this in many places when accompanying women. The current moral has this misogynous character or nature, and we need to achieve seeing women in a different way. Of course, in these 40 years, we have advanced a lot. Of course, that a lot of policies against gender violence have been developed. But when a woman denounces, still Istambul is not applied. Still, the operators do not know what they are talking about. Still, the lawyers cannot use those instruments to defend women from their aggressors. The women lawyers say, if I say this, they are going to think, what are you saying? they are still not applied in the daily lives. These regulations, they are still not applied, because otherwise we would be in different types of scenarios. What can we, the associations that fight or struggle for the rights of women, what can we do? The platform that I represent is working on that in 2013 in CEDAW and then in Istambul. And therefore, we have this participation of women with this shade of organizations. We think that the Istanbul Convention is really an advancement. But in the European Union, we don't have many directives relating to this. And this is why it is a very good news, piece of good news, the fact that in 2017, the European Union ratified, passed the law, and then it's pending ratification by some of the member states. But apart from the gender violence, I want to underline these reports that we have received as committee of experts in those countries that have ratified the convention. We have presented the 2014 CEDAW Shade report, the one in 2018, the one in 2019, and then the Istanbul report in 2019 as well. Today, my colleagues have gone to the meeting where we're having a voice to present our claims. In those 25 years after Beijing, we've seen qualitative advancements. We have included violence against women in the political agenda and the social agenda. But despite all this, in the reports that we have been presenting, we can see that the Spanish state is still not passing in the revision of the reports that have been ratified in the International and European Convention. And after 15 years after passing the organic law for protection against gender violence and the protection through appropriate and concrete measures, we still see a big deficit in its implementation and its development. For the Shade Agreement or Convention, signed in 2000, signed by 200 different parties. I think I'm lagging behind time. In these 4 years after the opinion of CEDAW, after ratifying the Istanbul Convention, the gaps that were at those times or at that time are still unresolved matters. And in the Istanbul platform, you can read the summary of the main barriers, the organic law that does not cover the gender violence in all its extension, the care of those girls and boys that are living gender violence. Well, this Istanbul Convention is really tackling all this. I'm going to skip part of my presentation because I want to read my conclusion. And I want to express how the feminist movement is pointing at the way we need to follow. And this is the most powerful instrument to achieve a future of free people. BEIJING+25, the regulations, the law, the conventions need to be in line with the demands and the goal of universal rights that is requested by this feminist movement and thousands of voices. Our aspiration is that the administration complies with their signatures and their ratifications and their agreements, and there's a crash against promises and ratifications that are not fulfilled. We are not stupid. I mean, all these barriers are part of the patriarchy, and we only allied can we fight against this. And so, as to be clear about this and what happens, we need to be very clear that everything that we ratify is decisive. But in the deep down, we need to fight against this perverse patriarchal system. And this requires a substantial and very deep change in all structures of power, political, economic, and even religious powers. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Nos hubiéramos quedado sin duda alguna escuchando la.
Thank you very much. We would listen to her much longer, and we need to go to the strike. Okay, there's no round Q&A session. We don't have time for this. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next session. Thank you.